Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third Masterworks concert of the season, which is our annual Beethoven and Blue Jeans concert. I'm here in the second floor gallery at the Coor Center to tell you a little bit about what's on the menu for this concert. So, Beethoven Blue Jeans, of course, is our popular annual concert, which features a work by Beethoven. This year, the work by Beethoven that's going to be a part of this, the centerpiece of this program, is his fifth and final piano concerto.
In the English-speaking countries, it's got the subtitle or nickname of Emperor. So Beethoven's Emperor Concerto forms the centerpiece. We are also closing the concert in the second half with the Symphony No. 2 by Johannes Brahms. When Brahms was around, they considered Brahms to be sort of the second coming of Beethoven or successor to Beethoven in a way. And to open the concert, we are presenting a overture. It's a brief overture by a French composer who was sort of the contemporary, sort of lived, sort of bridge between Beethoven and Brahms's time. Louise Farrenc, and her Overture No. 1 is going to open the program. Beethoven, as I mentioned, we are doing his Emperor Concerto. When he wrote this concerto in 1809, and he started working on it in July of that year. At the time, Austria and Vienna, where Beethoven was, of course, living at the time, was under siege by Napoleon's army, which I believe was like the fourth time this had happened in like 18 years. And there's an account of a huge bombing in 1809, and a lot of the nobility and the people who were well-to-do from Vienna had already escaped the city to escape the war. Beethoven actually sought shelter in his brother's house just on the outskirts of the city of Vienna. And the bombing was so bad, apparently, that he was hiding in the basement, and he apparently had like several pillows over his head and his ears, essentially ready to protect whatever little hearing he still had left at that time. There's a quote, actually, I'd like to share with you that he wrote in July of 1809, and he wrote this to his publisher. So he says, "We have been suffering misery in a most concentrated form. What a destructive and disorderly life I see and hear around me. Nothing but drums, cannons, and human misery in every form." And then after this, he started working on this piano concerto, which was premiered in November, but it was not premiered in Vienna because of the situation in Vienna. It was actually performed in Leipzig. A few months later, it was performed in Vienna. And based on the quote, you might expect a very gloomy or dark piece of music, but what Beethoven unveiled in Emperor Concerto is this very majestic, heroic, and almost uplifting piece of music that he was creating. It's interesting always to see, especially in people like Beethoven, we think of the example of when he penned the famous Heiligenstadt Testament many years earlier, when he was starting to really suffer from his hearing loss, and when he's talking about, is this life, worth carrying on? And then he comes out with his second symphony, which comes right after this, penning this very sort of desperate cry for help in a way, and then he writes this most energetic and cheerful symphony that you could imagine. So sometimes Beethoven, he would seek sort of escape in a way in what he was writing from the environment that he was surrounded in, and this is sort of a classic example of that. Interestingly, the earlier piano concertos, because Beethoven, of course, was a piano virtuoso, so the four piano concertos that precede this one, Beethoven himself played a solo part at the premiere. But for the premiere of this particular concerto, that he basically had realized that by the time this was played in 1811, that he realized that his hearing was at such a level that it was not practical for him to play publicly, especially in something complicated and complex as a full-blown piano concerto. So he actually had one of his pupils and other pianists who played the piece. What's kind of interesting is, as a result of this, Beethoven really wanted to take control in what the pianist would play in this concerto. In some of the earlier piano concertos, the unaccompanied section of the concerto, which we call cadenza. So essentially that's when the orchestra comes to a rest and the soloist just sort of plays this hugely technically demanding stuff to kind of show off their stuff, and we call this cadenza. And before the time of Beethoven, those cadenzas were often improvised during the days of Mozart, for instance. And Beethoven knew this tradition. So he would notate his own cadenza, but then he would allow each performer to come up with their own cadenza, come up with their improvisation in a way. And the Emperor Concerto is the only concerto in which he basically forbade other people from inserting their own cadenzas, but just to play Beethoven's own cadenza, regardless who was playing it. So here he's starting to actually, you can see a little bit, Beethoven started to control, in a way, as a composer, what the performers would do, because he himself was no longer performing the solo part, or was capable of doing so in public. The piece is in 3 movements. It's in the key of E flat major. When we think of Beethoven's pieces from the middle period, like from 1803, and then going into 1809, a little bit later here, starting with his 3rd symphony, which kind of heralded this heroic period with the famous Eroica Symphony. That's in the key of E flat major. And so for Beethoven, and for other composers too, but particularly for Beethoven, each key had sort of a different meaning for him. So for the key of E flat major was definitely, it meant something heroic for Beethoven, and he favored using that key during the middle period. And of course, so this concerto is in that key of E flat. So at the beginning, the orchestra sort of announces this key, this chord, and then right away the pianist plays sort of a mini cadenza, if you would. And then the thing is just kind of keeps on going back and forth. So then the orchestra comes back in with another chord, pianist answers, plays this almost like improvisatory figures. And then the orchestra does it again, the soloist does it again, and that's all sort of the introduction. And then that starts what we call sort of the exposition. So that's when usually in this case the orchestra, not the soloist, the orchestra presents all of the main themes from this movement. So that starts the orchestra exposition. And then usually following that, the pianist, the soloist, the pianist in this case, presents those same themes again. And that's what we call sort of the soloist exposition. And then these ideas are developed, and there's a lot of dialogue that happens between the soloist and the orchestra. And then that comes back to what we call recap, so recapitulation. And then Beethoven usually has a coda as well. So the first movement of this concerto is longer than any of the other first movements of his piano concertos. This is a kind of sort of epic proportion in a way. There's a sort of a stately, heroic, almost like march-like feel to some of the figures and some of the themes in this piece. Incidentally, Emperor, the subtitle or a nickname, I guess, Emperor, was not Beethoven's doing. We believe it was. There are some anecdotes. We don't know if any of them are actually accurate. But we do think that it was coined by his publisher. In Beethoven's day and earlier, a lot of publishers did this. They would they will get a string quartet or a piano sonata or a symphony or a concerto in this case from their composers. And to increase sales, they thought they would look at the piece and they were like, well, you know what? Let's call it something else. So they'll give it a catchy title in hopes of boosting the sales. Sometimes without the approval of the composers themselves. So that's sort of a different discussion. But so Emperor was not really Beethoven's own nickname for this piece, but it does have this very much a heroic quality to it. And then after the first movement comes a very serene, gorgeous second movement, where at the beginning of this, the strings are playing with their mutes, so it softens the colors of their instrument, has a very hushed feel to it. The piano also is playing almost like a dreamlike, just kind of floats above the orchestra a little bit, and while the orchestra plays this almost hymn-like a melody, just very simple, perfect contrast to the first movement, the epic nature of the first movement. And then the second movement, as the second movement comes to a conclusion, Beethoven kind of employs one of his favorite techniques, which is to connect the second movement of a concerto straight into the third movement. So without pause, he connects straight into the beginning of the third movement. And third movement is, again, contrast to the second movement. It's very bright, almost dance-like, almost like has almost like a German country dance sort of feel to it. And it's in the rondo form. So in the rondo form, you hear the main idea for the movement at the beginning of the movement, and it follows a contrasting episode. And then he'll present that main idea again before moving on to a new idea, and then coming back to so you will hear this main idea of the rondo movement, the third movement, quite a bit. And overall, it's such a gregarious and energetic movement to conclude this concerto. Before the blazing end to it, though, everything kind of, Beethoven had a little trick up his sleeve. So everything just kind of quiets down. And here ensues a very soft, almost like a duet, unusual duet in a way, because it's a duet between piano and timpani. And so that's, kind of a combination you don't often see. Definitely you don't see this written before this piece. And then before everybody joins again into a very joyful conclusion. For this performance of the Emperor Concerto, I'm very happy to bring pianist Andrew Armstrong, who might be familiar to many of you here, especially in Columbia and around South Carolina. He's now the artistic director of Chamber Music on Main series at the Columbia Museum of Art. He's been a regular presence at these concerts even before he took over the series. So he's been to Columbia many times performing chamber music, but I've always wanted to have Andy come and feature him as a soloist, a concerto soloist with us. And I'm just happy. I think this Emperor Concerto is a perfect vehicle for Andy, and looking forward to collaborating with him on that piece. After the intermission, we have the Second Symphony of Johannes Brahms. I mentioned earlier that when Brahms was a young composer, also he was a piano virtuoso as well. And this happened to many German composers after Beethoven. Whenever there's a young composer on the rise, and especially if they're pianists, and many of them are also pianists, all of the critics and older composers and audience members, there was always this inevitable comparison with Beethoven. And specifically when it came to writing symphonies. So it's almost like, we think of great athletes in a particular sport, and they become sort of like a standard, the gold standard, if you would, for the next generation of athletes in that sport. So whoever is considered sort of a great new player in that sport might get compared to, used to get compared to Michael Jordan, for instance, your basketball player, and so on. So same thing happened in composition too, especially because people just idolized Beethoven. But what was also interesting was it also was very heavily focused on symphonies. And for some reason, especially in 19th century, especially in Germany and Austria, in German-speaking part of Europe, they consider sort of symphony to be, symphony as in the completely instrumental, multi-movement works for orchestra, symphonies, as sort of the pinnacle of composition in a way. And they put Beethoven's 9 symphonies as sort of a model, if you would, sort of the sort of right up on the pedestal. And whoever was writing a symphony, they got compared to, well, how do they stack up, or how did they take Beethoven's symphonies and advanced it even more to suit the modern times, let's say. And so it was a lot of pressure for especially somebody like Brahms. So famously, when Brahms finally completed and unveiled his first symphony, he had already written so many other works, successful works, but he just struggled to finish his Symphony No. 1. And it took him at least 14 years. Some say it took him like 20 years to write it, based on the earliest sketches of the first symphony. And he was 43 years old when he was finally able to sort of, to debut his first symphony. And that was the big deal for him. And then, of course, whether Brahms liked it or not, one of the music critics, upon hearing the first performance of Brahms's first symphony, dubbed it Beethoven's 10th. So I don't know if that was like a compliment for Brahms, or whether, who knows, maybe he was happy about that comparison. But what's interesting is once he was done sort of with this process of trying to unveil his first symphony, once he got through the first one, the second one came very easy for him. So the first one came out in 1876. The second one was written next year, just really a few months later, a few months after the premiere of the first symphony. I think once he sort of, whether it was self-imposed pressure, or maybe it was, but a lot of musicians were sort of, wondering, when is Brahms going to actually give us a symphony? People like Clara Schumann, the wife of Robert Schumann, and so on. So I think there was external pressure, of course, as well. But once he got kind of over that hump, he was very eager to just kind of get the next one started right away. So he took a few months off during the summer of 1877, went to this like a lakeside retreat in Austria, and that's where he wrote the bulk of the second symphony. What was interesting was, at the same time as he was writing a second symphony, the other piece he was writing, he wrote, and this other piece is rarely performed today, but it was a motet titled "Why is the Light Given to the Wretched?" And it actually was a reflection, or based on the book of Job from the Bible. It's a very sort of a dark and gloomy kind of text, filled with despair and questioning God and so on. So it's like two entirely different things. He later explained, however, because there was, after sort of finishing the second symphony, after the first performance, sort of a fellow composer and music critic, a writer, wrote to Brahms and asked, is it really necessary to have all of that drama and the timpani and all the dark and gloomy stuff on the trombones in the first movement of the symphony? Otherwise, it's such a sunny and serene, almost pastoral type of symphony. Why do you have all of this like stormy stuff in there? And Brahms wrote back with a comment, something to the effect of, admitting that, he said he called himself a very melancholic man. And, behind every bright and hopeful music lies something dark and gloomy in his mind. And he said, well, if you're not familiar with this other piece I wrote during this retreat, the motet I had mentioned, then you might understand why the trombones do what they do, in the first movement of this. But otherwise, like I said, a lot of people compare sort of the Second Symphony of Brahms to, they call it sort of like Brahms's Pastoral Symphony, again, sort of in reference to one of Beethoven's symphonies, Symphony No. 6, which had the subtitle of Pastoral Symphony, and also compared to the very dramatic nature of the first movement of the First Symphony of Brahms. A lot of people felt maybe this is in contrast, that it has more of a serene quality to it, and sunny disposition, if you would, despite the dramas, as I mentioned. In this symphony, and again, Brahms here is sticking to his sort of taking some of his ideas were really based on the techniques that Beethoven used. So at the very onset of the symphony, you will hear in the cellos and the basses, right at the top of it, they will play this three-note figure. And you can't escape from this three-note figure because basically the entire symphony is based on those three notes. Not just the first movement, but essentially the entire symphony. So Brahms, again, was so great at taking a minuscule musical germ, if you would, and creating, basically spinning out an entire piece or entire movement based on that little fragment of an idea. Rather than, let's say, some composers like Schubert earlier, of course, a little bit earlier than Brahms, he was, like somebody like Schubert was great at writing melodies. So they will start with a melody and then develop those. Whereas Brahms, their ideas were actually much more fragmented. So rather than like an entire theme or entire melody, it might just be like a snippet of a melody, or it might not even be a melody. Like in the opening of the symphony, it's just the three notes. And then create an entire work based on that. So you see if you can sort of trace that idea, throughout these four movements. In the middle of the first movement, the second theme of this movement, a lot of people make the comparison of this theme. Again, it starts out in the cellos and the violas. Cellos have a prominent voice in this symphony throughout. When we get to the second movement, you will hear sort of the impassioned side of the cello playing in that slow movement. But here in the middle of the first movement, the violas and the cellos play this melody, this gorgeous melody that often gets compared to the famous lullaby by Brahms. And I don't know if that was intentional. He never makes mention of this, but a lot of people observe that, well, it just sounds just like that famous lullaby by Brahms. So listen out for that as well. The second movement, as I mentioned, is the slow movement of the symphony, starting, as I mentioned, with the cellos playing this very lyrical, but also very dramatic melody that gets tossed to the violins, and then the entire orchestra takes over. There is a sense of sort of a contrast in this movement. There are a lot of things where he will play the theme in one measure in a major key, and then follow it right after that in a minor key. So there's all of this sort of, again, like as he was telling his colleague earlier on about the first movement, there's always this sort of the contrast between dark and light, or contrast between turmoil and hope, that's sort of occupying the space right next to each other in this movement. The third movement then becomes sort of a relief from all of that drama. It's a very charming movement, very simple sounding. Starts out again with this time this similar kind of the three-note idea, as that's the whole basis for the symphony. But here it becomes an oboe solo, and a lot of the woodwinds kind of play. It's almost this kind of like a rustic slow waltz, if you would. That's the main part of the third movement. And then what he does is the form of it is sort of like A, B, A, B, A. So the A section is the slow waltz, and then he takes the exact same notes of the melody that he's using for the A section, and he simply just speeds it up like a lot, and that forms the B section. So that's the very sort of the lively interlude between these presentation of the slow waltz, this dancing idea. Then that leads to the fourth movement, which actually is it's very exuberant. Again, the trombones make a huge impact in this movement as well. What's interesting is Brahms uses one of his favorite instructions or indications especially to the strings in some of his orchestral music, and that is the use of the term sotto voce. So that means basically in subtone, or if you could think of it as soft voice. So it's not just, and when he uses this, it's not necessarily like he wants it just simply softer, but it's almost like a different color. It's almost like he wants it sound maybe more distant and without as much like presence in a way. So he has like the beginning of the movement starts out in the sotto voce, and then until like the entire orchestra just comes sort of roaring in. So he really kind of wants us to play with this huge contrast in dynamics and color, and throughout this movement. It ends in a sort of like a blaze of glory at the end with the brass making sort of a in a lot of for Brahms it gets fairly bright and present for the brass section at the end, at the concluding section of the Second Symphony, and it's always been my favorite to share Brahms symphonies here with this orchestra and with our audience. And but the Second Symphony, I don't think we've done together since like my second season or something like this. It's been a few years since we've done it together here, so I'm very much looking forward to that. And to open this concert, we are introducing you to the music of 19th century French composer Louise Farrenc. And she was born in 1804, died in 1875, and grew up in a sort of family full of artists. Both her father and her brother were prize-winning sculptors. And she herself, Louise, wanted to start on the piano. So starting at age 6, she started taking piano lessons. And also, but at the same time, she showed interest in composing her own pieces. And so she started taking some informal lessons from composers in Paris. And when she was 15 years old, she became the first woman to be admitted into the composition class at the Paris Conservatoire. And and then that sort of allowed her to further her studies and started writing pieces like symphonies, chamber music, solo works for pianos, for instance, and including this piece we're going to share with you, which is called Overture No. 1, that she wrote when she was in her 30s. When she was 17, she married another musician who was actually a flutist. During their marriage, actually, her husband sort of started focusing more on sort of music publishing side of things rather than on the flute as a career as a performer. So she also helped her husband out with sort of his business of publishing other composers' works and so on for a little bit. Until a few years later, actually, because of her skills and renown as a pianist and a performer. In 1842, Farrenc was appointed to serve on the piano faculty at the Paris Conservatory and was later tenured in that position, making her the only tenured female professor at the Paris Conservatory essentially during the entire 19th century. But she knew at the time that she was getting paid less than her male colleagues, other professors at the conservatory. So she wanted to fight for equal pay. It was unsuccessful for several years, but eight years later, in 1850, she wrote and premiered her newest piece, which was a nonette. So it's a chamber piece for 9 musicians. And to play the violin part, she happened to secure the services of a violinist, none other than Joseph Joachim, who was considered probably one of the most violinists living at the time. Also was a composer, and also Joachim is remembered today as being one of the best friends and collaborators of Brahms. So Joachim liked this piece, so he ended up playing in the first performance of this, which was very successful. And with that critical acclaim and success with the public of this latest piece in 1850, Farrenc went back to the administration asking for equal pay and was granted. So this is a first example, really, in composition especially, of somebody advocating for equal pay and getting it in the middle of 19th century. The piece we're going to play dates from before she was appointed at the conservatory to teach. It comes from like 1834. So Farrenc was about 30 years old when she wrote this. It's called Overture Number 1 for orchestra. She has 2 overtures. They don't really have subtitles or anything, or unlike some overtures that were meant to open opera or ballet or something like this, a dramatic work. This is just a concert overture, so there's not a plot or anything to follow here. But incidentally, Farrenc also wrote 3 symphonies, and many chamber music and so on. She didn't write an opera, actually, at least as far as we know. But her 3 symphonies are for those of you who are familiar with, let's say, symphonies of Mendelssohn or Robert Schumann, let's say, sort of the symphonist from the mid 19th century. Check out Farrenc's symphonies, one of her 3 symphonies as well, and I think you'll enjoy those pieces very much as well. This concert overture, so it basically has a slow introduction. It almost kind of reminds us of like very late Haydn, let's say, or early Beethoven in a way. You could probably tell those were probably her sort of models in writing for orchestra at this time. And so it's kind of a little dramatic, almost declamatory type of music, that stately music that opens the overture, and that leads into sort of the allegro proper section of the overture, which is very lively. Strings have many very rhythmically active, busy figurations. Again, little reminiscent of music of Mendelssohn or Schumann or so, as far as also with the busy strings, and contrasting that with the woodwinds having prominent role, playing melodic ideas, and so on. It's a perfect opener, really, to this concert of really old. This is all pieces from 19th century, starting from 1811 with the Emperor Concerto, and then this overture from the 1830s, and then ending with kind of fast forwarding a few decades, but ending up with Brahms' Second Symphony, which dates from 1877. So hope you enjoy the concert, and thank you for tuning in.